region in general. It could be in any of the issues, but anything that is concerning the society is what we are interested on. And we have had several presentations. This will be the 48th one, and this has been a very interesting platform. We have had those who are starting their PhD, those who are in the middle and on the collection, and last week and today we were lucky to have people who just completed their research and defended and already become a doctor, so congratulations in advance. And the areas we have covered, as I said, is in multidisciplinary areas, and it's very interesting also today to see another socially significant research to be presented. I will not introduce in detail her, but Dr. Maria, thank you very much for coming and joining us here today. Just the platform, I'll give her 20 minutes to do the presentation, and then afterwards we will open the floor for questions, comments, and discussions. Once again, thank you very much for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pirsit, and also my greatest thanks to the Hargeysa Cultural Center for offering me this opportunity to present my freshly published thesis. Thank you for Mr. Jama Muse also for his contribution, and thank you for my amazing local research assistants who made this possible tonight. My name is Maria Väkiparta, and as we heard, I recently defended my thesis, actually 5 weeks ago, in Helsinki, at the University of Helsinki, where I did my thesis. And without further presentations, I guess we go to my presentations. I hope 20 minutes will be enough. It might be slightly longer, but forgive me in that case. The title of my thesis is Young Men Against Female Genital Mutilation/Cutting, FGMC in Somaliland, Discursively Negotiating by Gender Norms and Gender Order. And just a few slides to give the background. So the framework in which I wrote my thesis is men and FGMC. So opposite to what is often thought, at least in the global north, in many countries where FGM prevalence is high, women and men express similar levels of support for or against FGMC. There also are countries where men are more willing to abandon the practice of FGMC than women. And there are countries where more women than men want the practice to end. Quite often men's opposition to FGMC stems from an understanding that religion does not mandate it, and that it may negatively impact sexual relationships, mainly marital sex. Men engagement in efforts against FGMC is thus increasingly studied and called for by both researchers and activists. But currently quite little attention is given to the role of young men, whereas the role of religious leaders, traditional leaders, fathers, political leaders is much more focused upon. Personally, I got curious about a report produced by UNICEF in 2013, which among many other new phenomena reported about young men who were publicly and collectively declaring their preference to marry uncut women. So my theoretical framework consists of theories on patriarchy, of theories on gender-based violence, and theories about men and masculinities. And here in this slide, I just try to summarize it in one picture, how I conceptualize FGM as a type of patriarchal violence. I heavily draw from sociologist Sylvia Valbu's theories on patriarchy, she maintains or argues that there is no one base superstructure patriarchy that causes women's subordination and different types of discrimination. Instead, she claims there are many separate, interrelated patriarchal substructures or fields, as she calls them, that constitute the patriarchal gender regime. And those 6 subfields are violence, state, cultural institutions, paid work, housework, and sexuality. And in this slide or picture, I try to briefly describe how FGM is related to all these 6 fields. And I argue that it both upholds and is upheld by many other patriarchal practices and structures. So starting from violence, FGMC is clearly a violation and violence, as it violates girls' right to bodily integrity and self-determination, and it has several short and long-term negative health effects. In terms of state, on the right-hand side of the slide, in those countries where FGM is widely practiced, they are often highly patriarchal, which means that it's often men constitute the majority of politicians, and quite often they do not effectively intervene in FGMC. When it comes to cultural institutions, men's monopoly to interpret religious texts and traditions upholds FGMC, but also rigid gender norms and male privilege. Going down to paid work, I argue that women's restricted access to paid work in countries and regions where FGM is widely practiced upholds women's economic subordination and dependence on marriage, which in turn contributes to the perpetuation of FGM. Because if mothers and the parents in general see that marrying the daughter is the best way to secure her future, and if FGM is seen as prerequisite to marriage, then that conclusion upholds FGM. Housework, in turn, the majority of housework and childcare assigned to women restricts women's access to paid work. And last but not least, in the field of sexuality, FGM is in many places performed to guarantee women's premarital virginity and abstinence from premarital sex. So, against this background, I built my thesis on the argument that research, the increasing research on men and FGM, should extend from just exploring men's opinions and attitudes on FGMC itself to exploring men's attitudes and practices which uphold FGMC, such as rigid gender norms, control of women's sexuality, women's economic subordination, and women's exclusion from formal positions of power. So, saying this, my aim, data, and methodology next. The aim of my thesis, is to understand but also problematize the role of young men in the prevention of FGMC. I focus on discursive practices of 15 young men who participated in anti-FGMC training and campaigning in Hargeysa, and some of them still do. My research questions are: how do these young men discursively negotiate violence against women, gender norms, and gender order? And whether these discursive negotiations deconstruct or reproduce those patriarchal gender regime and the locally prevailing masculinities. My data consists of semi-structured individual interviews with those 15 male students who were volunteering as FGMC activists. Additionally, I interviewed 4 female student activists and 7 people from local civil society organizations engaged in FGMC prevention. And my study is based on social constructionist understanding, which means that I understand language as both constructing but also constructed by the social reality. So my method of analysis is discourse analysis, which focuses on everyday meaning making in social interaction and texts. So the narratives and my data, I don't analyze it as a reflection of reality as such, but I'm more interested in how in these accounts produced by these 15 young men, social identities are constructed, as well as social relationships between people and systems of knowledge. So I pay attention to how different groups and categories of people, whether it's men and women, young and old, urban and rural, how they are presented, instead of taking it as the truth, what I read in the narratives and accounts. I also pay attention to how social relationships are presented, who is represented as the perpetrator, who is represented as the hero, who is represented as the most important agent in preventing FGMC, etc. And then also how systems of knowledge are constructed. What are the ideologies and belief systems that the so-called truths are based on, whether it's religion, tradition, culture, science, or some other ideology. So, in my data, I identify 4 overlapping discourses. The first 2 discourses, I argue, construct the understanding of FGMC, the essence of FGMC practices. And the first discourse is righteousness discourse. That's how I label it. And in the righteousness discourse, the young FGMC activists, they present, first of all, sunnah cutting. I assume that most of you are aware of the different types of FGMC. Just briefly, in Somaliland, the main types practiced are the pharaonic cutting and the sunnah cutting. The pharaonic cutting parallels the World Health Organization type 3, whereby part or whole of the clitoris is excised, as well as part of the labia minora and or majora, and only a small opening, and the rest of the tissue is sewn together, leaving only a small opening for urination and menstruation. This is also called infibulation. And this practice is still highly prevalent, especially in the rural areas. According to the official statistics, still the prevalence of pharaonic FGMC is close to 100%, but there is recent evidence that the milder type, the so-called sunnah cutting, is getting more more prevalent in the urban areas. And the sunnah cutting refers to the clitoridectomy and the World Health Organization type 1, whereby all or part of the clitoris is excised, requiring no stitches, no sewing together. So this latter sunnah cutting is presented as totally harmful. Not a big deal was a phrase used by some of these activists. And this is problematic because many studies show that in practice, as the case is, often the FGM is implemented by traditional health attendants or circumcisers, as they are also called, who are not aware of the different types. And often what happens is that to please the patient, so to say, they cut more than expected. because that's what they think that will please the mother, who is the one who organizes the cutting. And they are not aware of the different types. So labeling and presenting sunnah cutting as not a big deal, totally harmless, is problematic in that sense, because we know that there are different types, and sunnah cutting it can be anything. Also, sunnah cutting is represented as not mandated by Islam, but also not forbidden by Islam, which makes the young activists conclude that it's permitted. They say you can do it or you can leave it. These young men highly value women's premarital virginity, but same time, which is promising for FGM prevention, is that they decouple women's religious purity, which here refers to virginity and abstinence from premarital sex, from all types of FGMC. With this, I mean that they don't seem to think that any type of cutting is required to show or guarantee a woman's premarital virginity. Instead, they say and claim that women are capable of securing their premarital virginity by themselves. No external operation is needed for that, and that that is shown or signalized by veiling themselves and behaving modestly, which is the phrase they use. And veiling for them is both figurative, both like veiling physically by covering oneself, but also more in a more abstract way, meaning that refraining from any too close relationships with men. So that is the other meaning for veiling oneself. Figuratively, I think is the word. Yeah, this is actually the point that I just raised. So they attribute women's religious purity, that is virginity, and also women's religious righteousness to veiling oneself physically and figuratively. So the next discourse constructing the essence of FGMC in the discourses of these young FGMC activists, I argue, is the health discourse. And this is a discourse identified by researchers before me, whether they have been conducting their research among health practitioners, political leaders, or any group. This is a discourse that is widely identified. In my data, the health discourse contains the young activists presenting pharaonic cutting, which is the most severe type of cutting, as a severe risk to women's health. They also present this pharaonic cutting not as violence as such, but as a violation against women's right to marry, which you see I have in not in parentheses, but which is a kind of phrase which is not compatible with the human rights language as such, but anyhow they refer to a women's right to marry. And also, not in many, but at least in some of the discourses, they refer to women's right to bodily integrity, which also is promising for FGM prevention, because if you relate FGMC to women's bodily integrity, then your prevention efforts are not depending on the severity of the effects, the health effects, because then you are more promoting the principal right to bodily integrity for women, regardless of the health consequences of the practice in question. Also, not in all accounts, but in some of the accounts, this pharaonic practice is presented as hindrance to marital sex. And in terms of the perpetrators, it's very often the so-called ignorant mothers who are represented as the main perpetrators and guilty for violating the rights of their daughters, for violating the daughter's right to marry, etc. Then when it comes to the agency, the agency of different groups in FGMC prevention, so this young FGMC activists see women, especially young women, as legitimate because of their assumed subjective experiences of FGMC, whereas they show themselves, young men, as legitimate agents because they are the future leaders of the country. Then going further to the two discourses on gender norms and gender order in my data. So whereas the sense of FGM was constructed in the righteousness discourse and health discourse, the gender norms and gender order were constructed, first of all, in the hierarchical difference discourse. With hierarchical difference discourse, I refer to the understanding of men and women not only as completely different, but also different in rank, one being superior and the other being inferior. And here, this discourse is constructed by the young activists, first of all, presenting as Somaliland as gender equal. In their accounts, there are no major gender equality issues to be addressed, which also means that they do not frame FGMC as a form of gender discrimination or as an issue of gender equality, opposite to the international arena where FGM is increasingly framed as not only a human rights issue but also as a gender equality issue. But that's not apparent in my data. They justify the rigid gender roles and gender segregation, which means that women are assigned in the domestic sphere and men in the public sphere. And not only the segregation, but also men's superiority through Islamic interpretations and through what they refer to as gender balance. So in their accounts, it is a balance when women stay in the domestic and men in the public sphere. And some of these men accuse women for entering into men's position and also affirmative action, which is practiced by some international NGOs and other international organizations, for actually causing gender inequality and discriminating against men. This is not a comment phenomena in my data, but still I think it's interesting, and that's why I want to include it here in my presentation. And they also justify women's exclusion from formal positions of power, meaning political power, by presenting women as actually already having a lot of informal power behind the scenes. Then the last discourse, or the second of the discourses, constructing gender norms and gender hierarchy, I argue is the masculine responsibility discourse. So in this discourse, the young activists justify men's superiority through reference to men's heavy responsibilities and masculine protection that they are expected to offer women. They also quite strongly reproduce the male breadwinner norm, the single breadwinner norm. But interestingly, and opposing the prevailing masculinity norm, they accuse elderly people and men who are currently in positions of power, which is, for example, the medical professionals, but also religious and traditional leaders, for irresponsibility and neglect when it comes to FGMC prevention. Whereas they represent themselves and the young men in general as highly responsible, but also underrated and under-resourced. So, last few slides where I summarized some results and conclusions. First of my research questions was, how do young anti-FGMC activists in Somaliland negotiate violence against women? And based on my data, I argue that actually violence against women is still legitimated through, for example, framing the sunnah cutting as not harmful, categorically not harmful, and also as religiously permitted. Whereas violence is delegitimated through referring to women's principal right to bodily integrity in some of the accounts, and also through decoupling women's religious purity from FGMC. The second research question was, how do young anti-FGMC activists negotiate the prevailing masculine norms? And I argue that the culturally idealized manhood, the responsible man, is reproduced by emphasizing men as primary breadwinners, by emphasizing men as natural leaders. But the culturally idealized manhood is also deconstructed by challenging the superiority of older men. Then, about the feminine norms, whether they are reproduced or deconstructed, I argue that especially the religiously idealized womanhood is renegotiated by decoupling women's religious righteousness from the Sunnah FGMC. And also by decoupling women's religious purity, which means abstinence from premarital sex and premarital virginity from any types of cutting, and instead coupling it with modest behavior. And this, I argue, emphasizes women's agency in controlling their own behavior, instead of exposing the women and girls on practices like FGMC to produce marriageability and religious purity. And lastly, representing not pharaonically cut, sexually willing in the marital context, and sensitive women as characteristics of an ideal wife. Lastly, my third question was if these discursive negotiations deconstruct or reproduce the patriarchal gender regime in Somaliland. And unfortunately, it seems that even these young men certainly enthusiastically oppose the practice of FGMC. Still, in some of their accounts, they reproduce men's dominance, which I argue is one of the root causes for FGMC, making it problematic. So they reproduce men's dominance by not challenging women's dependency on marriage, giving women sexual pleasure and women's education and economic role mainly instrumental value as good for the husband and good for the family, instead of as subjective right, women's subjective rights. And also denying the inequality, justifying strict gender segregation with balance between gendered rights and responsibilities. And lastly, representing men as natural leaders and emphasizing women's informal roles, and even in some, though only few accounts, blaming women for marginalizing themselves, blaming that women want to stay at home. So my last slide goes back to my theoretical framework, where I showed my where I saw the 6 substructures or fields of patriarchy, as described by Sylvia Valbu. And in this slide, I have added briefly how the discourses I identified in my data actually support all of these substructures, patriarchal substructures. But I want to emphasize that showing and demonstrating how these very hidden, often hidden and naturalized discourses and discursive practices uphold patriarchal gender regime and gender equality are like visible in my data still, I'm not concluding or blaming these young men, because it's also important to pay attention to the power balances in Somaliland. So it's not that all men are equally powerful, and especially in Somaliland, which is highly gerontocratic, and the power is held mainly by elderly men. So we should remember that these young men who were from 17 to 25, I think, and they were all not married and didn't have family. They're not guilty of producing discourses. But what I argue from practical perspective, one of my practical conclusions is that all the organizations who are engaged in FGMC prevention should also pay attention to the root causes. So I argue that if you're engaged in FGM prevention, you can not only pay attention to the kind of health consequences on the surface, but you should you should go deeper, dig deeper, and look where the root causes lie and touch upon them as well, no matter how sensitive they are, and challenge them, and first make them visible and challenging them. And also, I still think, even after these findings, I think that it's very crucial to engage men, both young men and elderly men in all roles, whether as brothers, fathers, leaders, student activists. They should be engaged in FGM prevention, but they should not be engaged as warriors, which is sometimes made, because that kind of framings actually reproduce the gender hierarchy. And it's very crucial also when engaging men to make sure that the women are equally taken into consideration, and women's role in campaigns against FGMC are emphasized, and women are supported in their roles and shown not only as FGMC victims but also as active agents in the prevention of FGMC. So I think this is where I close my presentation. It certainly took more than 20 minutes. But thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much, Dr. Maria, for the interesting presentation, and don't worry about the timing. So now we'll open the floor for questions, comments, and all suggestions. Only one rule that we have. Please introduce yourself, who you are, and what you're affiliated to, and then the stage is open for everyone. Who wants to be the first?
Hello, my name is Robin Midlag. I'm an individual consultant, so the introduction is short. Thank you for the presentation and for coming out. My question is quite quick. You were basically saying that you found the anti-FGMC activists in the scope of what they were challenging quite limited, right? They were only challenging a very narrow part. Looking at sort of the general evidence on social movements and social movement organizations tend to take on a dynamic of their own and go beyond what they were initially intended and sprawl out and form subsystems. Do you see any potential for that in the people you talk to, in the activists you've been engaging with, that there may be a seed for starting at this point, but becoming bolder, more ambitious, more radical over time, or by the mere virtue of bringing these issues up, drawing in people, drawing in wider discourse, wider challenges, providing a platform for these over time?
I see that gradually happening, but I somehow still, being now a practitioner, actually I've been practically engaged in FGM prevention since 2017, engaged in one of the NGOs working in Somaliland. So I kind of see still quite big a difference between what is spoken about on international arenas about the framing FGMC as human rights and gender discrimination issue in comparison to what is actually happening in the field. So I feel, and this is not based on my thesis but on my role as a practitioner, that framing FGMC as gender issue is still not really operationalized in the field. So it's just a buzzword currently. But I haven't seen too many NGOs or other organizations actually really operationalizing, thinking that what would it actually mean if we frame FGM as a gender issue instead of a health issue. That doesn't properly answer your question, but if I may continue, if I see any seeds of more radical movement, I don't know what you mean exactly with radical, but at least there are some new openings in my data in terms of sexuality and human rights being mentioned in some of the accounts. I think that those are issues and perspectives that men talk amongst themselves. That's the impression I got from my interviews, that actually the sexual problems in marriage related to FGM are talked about amongst young men here quite a lot, at least in the urban context. But that's clearly something that cannot be talked about publicly. So I don't see that becoming part of the official FGMC discourse here very soon. But at least it gives one more incentive for the men to engage in these efforts. When it comes to human rights perspectives, I personally believe that that framing would give more, make the FGMC prevention work wider. But I also very clearly see both in my data and now in my work how difficult it might be to frame FGMC as a human rights issue. The human rights, it's no more truth than any other ideology. So it doesn't help a lot currently to frame it as a human rights issue. Human rights are understood very differently. I also work in Kenya, so human rights are understood very differently there. So yeah, do you want to specify your question in case I didn't answer it?
But the framing is not necessarily useful yet, and in the way it works. And it clarified a lot about the speed in which it takes up and the limitations both discursively and politically that it faces. Thank you for that.
And also, I must say that I don't know who would be the party or the institution or the agent to do it, but in order to change the gender discourse here, would take the religious leaders, the political and traditional leaders, should take the lead there. The power structures here are such that the young people cannot take a big role in that.
Okay, I'll give more chances. So we can take 2-3 questions at one time.
Thank you so much, Maria. My name is Pavin. I work with the regional office for Oxfam in Kenya. We apologize, first of all, for being late, so we missed part of your presentation. So maybe my question is probably going to be something that you alluded to. In terms of the anti-FGMC activists you were talking about, were they male, were they female, were they both? And was there a difference you saw in terms of how they presented their issues? If you did capture that, I'm really sorry, but it would be great to hear.
That's good that you take it up. It was my primary data consists of semi-structured individual interviews with 15 men, young men, anti-FGM activists. But I also, to enrich my data, I also interviewed 4 female student activists from the same group. Later, I must say, it would have been interesting to have more women, but as there is so little research on men currently, so I wanted to concentrate on men. Anyhow, based on my very small sample of 4 women, it was surprisingly little differences in the discourses, basically none. When it comes to framing or labeling Suna cutting as violence or not, in labeling Suna cutting as harmful or not, in constructing gender hierarchies, who is inferior, who is superior, there was hardly any difference. one tiny difference was in this masculine responsibility discourse where, if I remember correct, 3 out of the 4 female interviewees represented domestic duties, childcare, as the responsibilities of men, and that was the only major difference. But as I write in the end of my thesis, in like where I identify future topics for relevant research, so it would be very interesting to make something like similar study among young female activists. But this was mainly based on men's discourses. And also I must say that as the sample was not only small, but also very kind of strategic, so I only had, and on purpose I only had young, urban, highly educated, already engaged men. So naturally this work is not anyhow representative of the men in Somaliland. It's only these young men, educated activists, and I on purpose wanted to have this sample because I wanted to see how these really enthusiastic anti-FGMC opponents, volunteers, talk about the other gender issues.
My name is Hamza Abdullah Kalinle. I have a bachelor degree of medicine and a master candidate of human nutrition at this time. So, and I want to thank you, Dr. Maria, for your presentation and research that you have done here in Somaliland. So my question, I have one question and one comment or suggestion. So let me say that my suggestion, let me present to you. My suggestion is, now as you mentioned it here, you mentioned it Sunni type and Fulani type. So there is differences according to our context. Fulani type, this FGM generally is based on mainly, the 2 major pillars that it's based on are cultural and also religion. But the Fulani type, it's only based on culture. But in religion, it's prohibited. It's not allowed in our religion. But in Sunni type, our religion encourages to practice. But there are some specific criteria to be done in order to fulfill the requirements that our religion orders to do or to follow. So that's it. So maybe I'm suggesting to do further research for the religion perspective of Fulani type and Sunni type. And my question is, you mentioned that you interview with 15, social activists, especially anti-FGM activists, although I'm a member of anti-FGM activists. So do you think that it's quite enough for you to get the exact information from those members? Because of you using a structured interview and interviewed 15, don't you think that it's more appropriate to interview people among the community who are dealing with this problem? So I think you got my question, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Starting from the first question or suggestion about the religious status of the different types of FGMC. So as was shown in my data as well, it wasn't anyway clear for these 15 men, even though they had just participated in training, how they think about the religious status of these different types. So actually in my thesis, first of all, I'm not expert on Islam. I'm not claiming to be, so that's to be taken into consideration. So anyway, I used this five categories that the social phenomena might be categorized according to Islam, whether it's obligatory, whether it's recommended or honorable, permitted, disapproved, or forbidden. And when I try to organize the data, so I find these 15 men categorizing these 2 types in all of those categories almost. So clearly it's not, you state quite clearly what is your view, but clearly we are talking about interpretations of Islam. And also when you look at it globally, there are different interpretations done, because when you look at, for example, Saudi Arabia, an Arabian peninsula where Islam originates from, FGMC is mainly not practiced there at all. So that just shows us that different interpretations are made, and that's it. So Islam, there are some sentences both in Quran and Hadiths, but they can be interpreted in many ways, and that's the discussion going on, and I don't think that I will have a role in that discussion. So I leave it to you. So I throw the ball now back to you. What was the second question? Yeah, why I did not study the phenomena in the community. So that's a good question, but as I said, maybe actually in the earlier response, so I was specifically interested in people who are heavily engaged already in FGMC prevention. And because I think it's important when those people who already have a role in this prevention, how they frame it, and whether they are willing to go deeper. It's quite easy to oppose a practice that is widely framed as violence, and this is universal. This is also in my home country, Finland. We have a huge problem with domestic violence. We are the second most dangerous country for a woman in Europe. So it's quite easy for many politicians to oppose domestic violence in the case of Finland and pharaonic FGMC here. But then again, for quite many, it's not that easy to touch upon the root causes and admit that it's actually the women's subordination that is root cause, one of the most important root causes for this violence. And it has to be addressed if you want to address the violent practice.
I'll give 2 chances and then I'll bring it back to you. We will do 2 questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
My name is Ahmed Kasim, and thank you for your good presentation and concluding for your long research. I am one of your first participants or social activities who had taken part, your interview, and in first time when you came in the country. Maria, can you share with us the main obstacles that you faced during your research inside Somaliland or your country? The main obstacles that you faced or circumstances that you faced?
The main
obstacles? Yes.
For me as a researcher?
Yes, in research.
It was interesting actually because I had no major challenges practically. Initially I was planning to do a comparative study. We have a big Somali diaspora in Finland. So I was planning to conduct comparative study amongst the Finnish Somali diaspora and then Somaliland. But the problem was that I could not get access to the Finnish Somali diaspora. Back then I was not known among Finnish Somalis, and that they didn't want to be interviewed on this topic, even though the focus was on FGM prevention and their role as in the prevention of the practice. So, but when I started then finding access to Somaliland, after that I didn't have any major problems. There were some security issues, but that seemed pretty overemphasized by others. But when I entered the country, I had no problem at all, and all the arrangements were very smooth, and everything went well, and all the participants arrived as agreed, and yeah. I don't know if you mean some different kind of problems, but
hello everybody, my name is Asia. I work here at the center, and I just want to add one comment on what my friend over there said about FGM and Islam. You know, as a Somali Muslim woman, I don't think it's allowed to do this kind of, like, it's such a horrific action. Like, and I think it's very like crucial thing to use religion to dictate what to do with the, female body, and I think it's wrong to say that religion allows it, but it doesn't in any type of, like, if it's pharaonic or it's sunnah. And yeah, that's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for a comment. That shows that there are very different interpretations And that's one which I must say I agree with.
Hi, my name is Habon. I work at Nigad Network, and I just wanted to ask a quick question of, did you provide definitions of the different types? For example, is there a definition of what pharaonic is? Is there a definition of what Sunnah is? And I'm sorry, I did miss the presentation, so I wasn't aware if you did provide it in there.
Yeah. In the written book, yes, and I use the local types. So I talk about Sunnah cutting and pharaonic cutting. In the text, I don't take into consideration the Sunni too, which seems to be increasing here. And in terms of terminology, when I did the interviews, I always try to be very specific that when I talk about FGM, female genital mutilation, or female genital cutting, I always refer to all of the types. Because in Somaliland, FGMC amongst the people quite often is understood as the pharaonic cutting only. So that was a little bit of problem, even though I emphasized it throughout the interview, that when I talk about cutting and when you talk about cutting, so which type do you refer to? But as I couldn't ask it every time they very often they FGM this, FGM that. Sometimes I try to specify, do you specifically mean Sunni or pharaonic or all? But it wasn't always fully clear which they referred to, but in the big picture, it seemed that when they refer to FGMC in my data, they mean only the pharaonic. So that's a bit of the problem in FGM prevention, not only here, but specifically here.
My name is Kadra Amar Hassan. I am from Nefis Network. As well as I am involved for so many years the civil society, especially women issues. And I am so wondering, why are you interested to make your thesis in the FGM since you're on the Finlandese and there is no any FGM in your country? Why are you interested? Can you please explain that? And other question that is, since you know the problem is that we have, do you have any plan to support us on any advice or any contribution in your idea and your expertise, since you are the PhD thesis? So we need the person like you. So what's your plan, the next step, and where are you interested to make your thesis in the FGM? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I got interested in FGMC actually because for many years I was a UNICEF volunteer, and for some reason I started reading these reports, and this phenomenon interested me because it's a type of, first of all, it's a type of gender-based violence where women comprise both the victims and the primary perpetrators. And I was also, it's wrong to say fascinated, but interested about the socialization process and what is behind the mothers seeing FGMC as the best for their girls. So this contradiction kind of interested me, and I read so many reports, and I noticed at some points that I have quite a lot of information that I could almost write a thesis. First it was a joke, but then it became a book. Luckily, I'm very privileged because in 2017 I was recruited by a Finnish NGO that is engaged in FGM prevention in the Horn of Africa, here and in Kenya. So I do my best every day in my work to now make use of my thesis. And I think one of the most important takings is to make sure that FGM is not framed as only a health issue, but that we do our best to touch upon and address all these other types of discrimination, especially women's economic subordination. I think it's very important to empower women economically and to support their role as breadwinners, which also I think then it's important to engage the husbands so that we don't end up increasing the risk of domestic violence or something like that. But in the organization that I work for, we do both. We do women's economic empowerment and FGMC prevention. And there are many reasons for that. One is that especially in the rural areas where FGMC is mainly not seen as a problem at all, economic empowerment work gives us not only access but also legitimation. That's one thing. But also supporting the women economically, finally at one day means that those women can be role models and show the parents that actually women can support themselves independently. The marriage is not the only way to secure the future of the daughter. So that's my plan. I think so, yeah.
Hi, thank you for your fascinating presentation. The name's Stuart Brown. I'm the head of the British office here in Hargeysa. Now, I reckon your study has been focused on Somaliland, and the very focus of it, and the reason for doing it is because there's not much of a data set on these issues. But based on your experience elsewhere and engagement elsewhere in Africa, how are the attitudes you came across and have focused on here in Somaliland, how do they compare and contrast with what you've anecdotally observed about in other places?
I'm not quite sure. Would you summarize your question?
So, is there anything unique or special about the attitude of Somalilanders to FGMC and activists vis-a-vis those you've maybe come across in Kenya or elsewhere, recognizing that you haven't studied those in depth?
If I get it right, I think the connection to religion is something that makes FGMC prevention a bit more challenging here, I think, because even though it's very clear that it's not mandated, any of the types, I think that most of the people in Somaliland agree with me that none of the types is prescribed or mandated by religion, by Islam in this case, but one of the most important reasons perpetuating the practice is the understanding of the people, especially in the rural areas, that it is, especially the Sunni type. And that understanding is very, very difficult to change. We NGO people have hardly any role in that. We don't have any religious authority. And it's not very easy to engage the religious leaders. What some NGOs have done, that they've collected a group of religious leaders and send them to, for example, Saudi Arabia to have a discussion, a forum with local religious leaders there, so that they would see that different interpretations can be made and bring them back. But it seems quite challenging still for the local religious leaders, first of all, to publicly talk about this and to publicly condemn the different practices, and that makes the prevention a bit more challenging here. Whereas comparing to Kenya, it's not a religious issue at all. It's know-how related to religion. What we do, for example, FGM prevention in the Kisi region, which is Christian among Christians, and there actually the local church is our main ally. So there it's rather a rite of passage. It's a cultural issue. So the root cause is quite different in different communities, and that's one of my arguments, that you have to find the root cause and address that instead of the consequences. The consequences, the health consequences, are always important because you have to kind of address both the supply and the demand. You have to address both those, the health effects, that kind of those reasons that perpetuate the practice, what creates the demand, whether it's that people think it's religious prescription, whether people think that it's the only way to make the girls adult women, or whether it's that's the only way to get them married, or whether it's that's the way to it can somewhere it's actually related to physical beauty conceptions. So you have to find the root cause, address that, and at the same time show that in addition to FGM not bringing actually these advantages, it brings disadvantages, which are all these health consequences, psychological and social consequences.
My name is Ahmed Kasim. I'm the Managing Director of Strategic Initiative for Research and Development. I've been working with the FGM issues for the last 7 years, and I did many different programs in Somaliland and from the East African countries. What I have seen is that during that time I did many different research programs in Somaliland. I have been leading many different research programs in Somaliland. The conclusions was that there are three main things and three main root causes of FGM in Somaliland. The first one is traditional, religious perspective and the view of virginity. The view of virginity and the traditional can be solved by somewhere, but in the religious context, it cannot be solved. So what I have seen is that FGM is something related to the religion that cannot be maybe covered by anyone. One of the time I have been working with a program which was funded by DFID. It was a TGG program, the Young Generation program. We have been working to support the young people in Somaliland, or we have been established by Youth Anti-FGM in Somaliland. But what we have seen is that the root causes and the main issues which needs to be discussed and which needs to be maybe engaged and solved is that the religious leaders are the main and the integral part of ending FGM in Somaliland. I'm not sure if you are aware, maybe before 2 weeks or 3 weeks, it was established Somaliland Strategic Advisory Group of Religious Leaders, which we are expecting to end FGM in Somaliland, maybe by the end of, maybe by the next couple of years, but we are not sure. So my suggestion is that the young people have a role of ending FGM in Somaliland, but the main role is to be engaged with the religious leaders, and the religious leaders cannot be covered and cannot be maybe neglected. This is religious issues, and when we have a many different arguments with them, they can see simply the religion cannot be interpreted by Saudi Arabia or by the other countries who are not maybe practicing by FGM. We are Shafi'i, and Shafi'i is practicing by FGM. Maybe not FGM, and maybe the interpretation and the understanding of the word of FGM is really also needs to discuss a bit more. Maybe people are doing FGM and they said we are doing Sunnah, and that is not the reality of Sunnah. Maybe they are practicing something different with the Sunnah. So maybe what I can see is that still we are in the same position. We cannot be changed anywhere, we cannot be reached anywhere until we have much engagement with the religious leaders and helping with them in a very good maybe engagement with the religious leaders and reaching in a good conclusion. So thank you very much. You did a very great maybe research which needs to be maybe do again and maybe to emphasize it more. So I really thank you for your research. Thank you
for your comment.
I just wanted to take the mic. I don't know, is it only me or is it difficult to hear clearly? I'll give to her.
Thank you. Thanks so much for your very interesting, interesting presentation. Again, sorry for coming late. My name is Amy. I work for Oxfam here in Hargeysa. My question is, I'm curious. You said the economic empowerment is the key to unlocking kind of the root causes. I'm curious as to why the economic versus, say, political empowerment or focusing on domestic violence. I'm just interested in why that.
I didn't mean, I don't know what I said, but I didn't mean that economic empowerment would be more important than some other. Just saying that that's what the organization I'm working for is currently doing. So looking at the previous slide, so personally I think that the changes are needed and gender roles and norms must be challenged in all of these substructures, whether it's the role of women, empowering women as the authorized interpreters of ideologies like Islam or tradition, and also the role of women in politics. We need more female politicians because we need the women's experience amongst them, those who enact the laws. And we definitely need to, we cannot empower women economically and support them as entrepreneurs or productive in their productive role without also addressing how the domestic work is divided between the spouses. So all these fields must be addressed, and I hope there are other actors are welcome to join. And I know there are already many NGOs not only focusing on FGM.
My name is Jama Musa. I'm director of this cultural center. I found this really interesting. The thesis, I read it before you came here. As you have seen that the thesis is available on the web, so you can download. So I really suggest people to read the work. So congratulations first of all for the wonderful work that you have done here in Somaliland. What happens, what I noticed is that, we in the academia sometimes we have some problem with the so-called NGO research, because there's always conflict between this group of kind of research. What I found this thesis is the combination of the right thing for both sides. Someone who is so close to the people, to the as activist, so it's seen from the result from the thesis that you have done. So again, I found it interesting from that aspect of your work. But I want to take on another part, on cultural aspect, and most importantly about the language. I don't know if the group that you worked with, they were speaking among them in Somali or in English. Because I think it's really interesting to see now you are presenting, if you were presenting in Somali, I think it sounded much different of what you have said here. Certain times it's quite taboo even to mention what talking about sexuality, talking about virginity. I don't know how they would express feeling of the real aspect of the. So this is, I consider a human rights violation and something so humane that we have to be close when we are talking about FGM. I think it will be the time that we speak in Somali about this stuff. So my one question is, how would you see your thesis translated into Somali? Because I think that would make much impact among the young men who are reading your work and are talking about. The second thing is, it's about the time. I'm really happy to have Abdurrahman who is saying, talking about that we have to be close to the religious group is now to talk about the issue, but it is about the time to talk in the schools in this issue. That is, I think, the main point that we as a Somalilanders have to start to talk in Somali when we are talking about this issue. Second, taking these issues in the school and the younger generation. One last thing is about engaging with men on this issue, with young men mainly. I always consider it problematic when we are talking about the gender issues, and then we consider it's like women issues, woman problem, instead of talking into the gender as a problem for the society. Similar thing happen since we are in the cultural center and we are dealing about the issue of the youth. When we are talking youth, that's as an absolute thing. We have to talk about intergenerational when we are talking the issues that has to do with the young people. We can't talk about the young people alone. If not, we can connect to the other generation. Similar thing about the gender. So I really admire the work that you have done, and it's about the time that young men be engaged. Maybe not only young men, but together, and it would have been better if maybe we engage both gender.
Thank you so much for a comment. First of all, I'm delighted to hear that you find kind of both my activist and my researcher side in the book. I must say that it wasn't always easy to struggle between, because as often as you hear about how wonderful it would be that the research would kind of feed into the practical work of NGOs, political decision makers, or any other organization, I must say, having been there in between myself, so it's not an easy position, because when in academia, I must say I always felt that I was seen as all too practical or idealistic or kind of non-objective somehow, whereas when at work I still am sometimes seen as all too academic, and I unfortunately see that those institutions are not really communicating, and I don't think this is just an issue between the specific institutions I'm referring to, or just a problem in Finland, but I'm so lucky, because I know latest by now that my book, academic publication, will not just be left there in the academic library, touched upon by only my opponent. It will be used and read and utilized, and I most warmly welcome you to translate it, and I can try to help to find funding for that. It would be wonderful. That's the reason I wrote it. I think I can say it here that I don't have that much academic ambitions, so I think I will stay as a practitioner, and I would love to have it translated. And when it comes to the whether it would be different book and the conclusions different, I don't know, and I don't have the Somali skills yet. I should have it, but currently no. So I gave my interviewees the opportunity to speak their own language, and I would have preferred them to. I had 2 translators available, but somehow the interviewees didn't want to use the translation assistance. They wanted to talk English with me. Of course that causes a bit of problem, especially when you engage in discourse analysis, especially if you do the micro level. So in my case, I didn't even try, or I didn't find it anyway meaningful to pay attention to the words they're using or the structure of the sentences, anything like that. So I'm doing quite macro level discourse analysis, and it might be an interesting enterprise for another researcher to do more micro level, because I of course have the Somali data available, and it's well transcribed thanks to my research assistants, local research assistants. So, but not only the language, there is also an issue with my research positionality. Of course, being a Western non-Muslim woman doing these interviews, it as such affects the data. So for sure, the discourses would have been different, and the accounts would have been different had the interviewee being a elderly Somali man, for example. So that's one thing, but I still think that that could be interesting comparison to see what kind of discourses are produced and analyze the difference. Why is this?
Hello, good evening. My name is Mona. I work with Oxfam Hargeysa. My question is, I'm a little bit curious about these young men anti-FGM activists. How long they were working in the field, what makes them passionate, and what basis of their activism, where they were coming from. Is it the right, human rights? Is it the health-wise? Is it, what was? We would like to know their background, because it's good to engage young men. Are they also having kind of engagement with elder men? Because this kind of effort need is the elder men also have some decision making, since these young people, they don't have in the decision making in the community and also political wise. Have they had some kind of engagement with the elders? So, thank you very much.
Very good question. By the time of the interviews, which was September, October 2016, they had just finished a training by a local NGO about FGM. I was actually expecting to interview men who have been a bit longer time engaged in FGM prevention, so most of them had not much practical experience. They had quite idealistic views actually about the actual campaigning, because they had just finished the training and only a few of them had had some prior actual experience. I didn't focus on their motives for engaging in FGM prevention, but my understanding is that for many of them, they clearly saw themselves as the future leaders or fathers of this country, and they see this practice as a national health problem which they want to solve as the future fathers of the country. So that seemed to be the main motivator. But I will warmly encourage someone to study more about the motives, but I think my background wasn't suitable for studying the motives. But it would be highly interesting to study the motives of men compared to women for engaging in FGMC prevention, and also what are the factors that contribute to them, like longer engagement. Because I had a chance to meet these men and present my preliminary results. Was it 2018, I think, when I visited Hargeysa? And at that point, which was 2 years after my data collection, I think I only managed to meet 7 of them, and out of those 7, 2 were by that time employed by local NGOs, and they were very enthusiastic FGMC campaigners, whereas some of them had totally forgotten about the issue. And one issue is also the way that they were recruited, and I don't know exactly how typical it's here, but voluntarism can be understood and defined in many ways. So in this case, it was a local organization that wanted to recruit student activists, so they contact the local university, and it's the university management that nominates these most promising students. So that has some connection to the motivation and also the lengthy engagement of these men. So if it doesn't initially come from inside, but you are rather nominated.
Final question. Unfortunately, I've missed your presentation, so you might have actually answered this question. But my question is, in the discourse of FGM, there's this huge divide of using the word mutilation versus cutting, as mutilation versus cutting as one of them, humanizes with the perpetrator. So my question is, did you take into account, did you use both words in your research? And what are your just take on in using one versus the other?
Yeah, I had some ethical discussion with myself and with my supervisors, and I changed my mind along the way. Quite long time in the written book, I referred to FGC only, female genital cutting, because the acronym FGM is here so connected to the pharaonic only, and also because in the field when doing my data collection I used the FGC. But then quite at the late phase of writing the book, I was advised to, in the book, refer to FGMC because that's now the hybrid term used by the international or organizations involved in this. So it was a bit of a tactical move to refer to FGMC in the book and when talking about in general. But when I refer to some specific, when I specifically quote someone, I use the specific term, and also when referring to these two types, I talk about sunak cutting and pharaonic cutting. So there is no simple strategy. I have quite lengthy chapter describing how I use different terminology, both in the book and when doing the data collection. And as, I don't know if you heard, but that also caused me a bit of problem when analyzing the quotes, because it's not always clear what type the interviewees are referring to.
So I know some of you still have some questions, but I have to say this is the end for the time. Thank you very much, Dr. Maria, again, and congratulations for finishing your thesis and for bringing it back to the community. The book is available in the library, and those of you who want to come and read it, we will make it available for you. Thank you very much for coming, all of you. And one last reminder, if anyone has not signed up for the sheet or for the registration sheet, then it's available. Thank you.